Thanks, guys. It's fantastic being our little evacuation shed, isn't it? Like
awesome.
Our normal little spots down the river flooded. So we've sort of evacuated to this little local shed. So welcome to Red Gum. If this is your first time joining in with us, it's just really great to have you. And it's not every day that we actually do this. It's once a week. And it's a special thing to gather together and actually, just for a moment, have a look into how God works and how He wants to relate to us. So that's where we're heading this morning. I don't know what sort of language you use in normal life, but I just have a really big dislike for Christian jargon. When I'm praying for someone, when I get to the end of that, I rarely ever say the word amen. I will often just say like, thank you, Jesus, or I'll say the end, or leave it as some awkward silence. There's one word you'll never hear me use. It's the word hallelujah. I just don't use it because it comes from ancient Hebrew culture, and I just don't think it's necessary. In fact, most clubs and sporting groups or interest groups have their own language, have their own words. When we were in Sydney, I bred and showed Japanese koi fish. And if you didn't know what a kinkai yatsuri was or a kahaku, you're obviously ignorant. You were just a newcomer. You weren't part of the inner group. I don't like even in-house humour, and I try to avoid in-house words because if the first time you're watching was today, if the first time you walk into a Red Gum gathering, I don't want you to feel uncomfortable because you don't know the languages we're speaking. I don't want you to hear words that you don't understand and feel like you're not part of the inner group. If you walk into a Red Gum gathering, I want you to feel like you're in the centre of everything right from the start. You'll never hear me doing a series entitled The Atonement, sanctification, justification. Like, I hardly know what those words mean anyway. But we do cover those subjects, but I don't want to use those words. Now, all of what I've just said to you this morning has created a problem for me because we're about to start a new series and I'm calling it Embracing God's Ways. And that little word, God's Ways, it's not a word that we relate to easily. It's not a word that we sort of use in everyday language. It's not religious jargon, but it's not a word we use because it's actually a biblical concept and it's foreign to the way we do life. Now, just recently, someone told me that they were upset with me over something that I had said. And they were told what I said. They weren't part of the original conversation, but they are told what I said through someone else that had obviously filtered it through their own interpretation of what I meant. Then they passed it on to the next person and they saw it through their own eyes. And it was fundamentally my own poor communication that was behind all of this. Now, just to be clear, I would like to communicate well, but I don't always. Sometimes even in my preaching, I think I've actually shared a point that connected everything together and I've just forgotten it. I've just left it behind. And then I'll listen to it afterwards and think, gee, that was a bit confusing. So anyway, here's the thing. Had my brother Jeff been told what I said and what that meant, he would have had a very different response because he would have said something like, well, I don't know exactly what Lex said because I wasn't there, but I know that he wouldn't have meant how you are feeling, how you are interpreting, how you felt that came across. Now, how could he say that? Well, Jeff has the advantage of knowing me over a whole lifetime. He knows my heart. He knows my beliefs, my values. He knows my ways. Now, Moses, in Exodus chapter 33, he records a really significant prayer that he prayed to God. And this is what he prayed. Teach me your ways that I may know you. And God's response to that, you'd expect to be something like, yep, I'll do that. That's a great idea, Moses. But he does something a little bit unique. He actually says to Moses, not only have I heard your prayer, but I'm going to show you how I'm going to answer that, and I'm going to show you the benefits to your life. And this is what God says. My presence will go with you. That's how he's going to answer the prayer. And I will give you rest. Moses wasn't seeking rest, but God said there's a benefit to knowing my ways, and it is rest. It's massive. Moses, you don't even understand this yet, but it's coming. You're going to experience my rest. Now, 500 years later, I don't know if you've prayed a prayer and remembered it 5 years later, but 500 years later, David, who has read this prayer that Moses has written, he actually reflects on it in Psalm 103. And David says this, he made known his ways to Moses, his deeds to the people of Israel. There's a big difference between those two. And I'm going to look at that in a moment. We're going to come back to that verse. But first, I just want us to jump forward 1,500 years, 1,500 years since Moses prayed that prayer. And there's a commentary on it. And it's a commentary in the Bible itself. It's in Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews. And he writes this commentary. Now, mostly the Bible's already written, and you can read commentaries on the Bible that was written 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. But to actually have a commentary in the Bible on the Bible is quite unique. And in Hebrews, it's God's talking, and I'm going to give you just the highlights of what he says. It's reflecting back to Moses' prayer to this time in Israel's journey. And this is what God says. For 40 years, Israel, they saw what I did. They saw the miracles. They saw the Red Sea part. They were fed every single day miraculously. They saw people that were poisoned by snakes live. And see, they saw all these things. But God says their hearts kept going astray. And he gives us the reason. Because they did not know my ways. They knew what God did, but they did not know who God was. And it says, so they never entered my rest. If fundamentally you know God through what he does, you will live life continually disappointed, confused at times by what God does. You'll become angry at God because you can't understand what he's doing, why he didn't do something, why he didn't do what you would have expected, what seemed right to you, what made sense to you. And if you judge God by what he does, you'll live in that confused state all of your life. You may even have stories of how God has supernaturally, miraculously provided finance for you or healed you or done something for you. You'll have stories of what God's done. But when he doesn't do the next time what you think he will do, you'll have this very negative response to God. I had a friend that when she was young, she got to know who God was. But when she was 16, her dad was diagnosed with cancer. And so she started praying and asking God to heal her dad. But he died. And she's lived the rest of her life bitter and angry at God, disconnected from him. Have you ever cried out to God, it's not fair? My grandkids sometimes, they'll say to me, it's not fair, it's not fair. And I say to them, well, fairness is actually overrated. Like, fairness is an illusion. Like, God does not live in fairness. He doesn't try to be fair. He lives in this tension between justice and mercy. And at times we're crying out to God. We're saying, God, it's not fair. But really, we don't really want fairness. We actually need God's mercy. When Jesus had a leadership team of 12 disciples, he picked out 3, Peter, James and John, that did all the special things with Jesus. They're like teacher's pet. They wherever Jesus was doing something really cool, that's what they were doing with Jesus, and left the other 9 out. Now, that's not fair. And what makes it worse, James and John were brothers. That makes it worse. And then when this early church starts to get going, after Jesus has left, James, who's one of these top 3 favourites of Jesus, James, he's arrested and thrown into prison. And then they take James and they take a sword and they kill him. Now, Jesus invested so much special time with James. He was a leader of the early church. And when Herod got the latest opinion polls sent to him, he realised that the population of Israel loved this, what he'd just done. So he gets really excited and he goes out and grabs Peter to do the same thing with Peter. But in the middle of the night, Peter's in jail waiting to be executed, and an angel wakes him up, and they tiptoe out of the prison together. All the doors just open supernaturally, and he walks out. Does God love Peter more than James? Well, why did James die and Peter live? That's not fair. In Acts chapter 2, beginning of the whole chapter of Acts, the story of Acts, at the very beginning, Peter gets up and preaches his very first sermon that he's ever preached. 3,000 people get saved that day. And in chapter 6 of Acts, Stephen, who's described, I'll read to you how Stephen's described. It says, Stephen is a man full of God's grace and power who did great miraculous and wonderful signs amongst the people. And this Stephen, he's arrested. And he gives his speech. And it's twice as long as Peter's. And it's recorded word for word in our Bibles. And no one gets saved. I think there's a lesson there for preachers. The longer you preach, it doesn't necessarily work to your advantage. It doesn't help people. Like, I should learn a lesson, shouldn't I? And then Stephen is publicly killed. They take rocks and they cave his head in until he dies. Paul, who wrote 1/3 of the New Testament, he was there. He's watching this. He gives approval to it. But it does not change him. And Stephen dies, and he can't even claim that in his death, Paul was so affected by this amazing man who died a martyr, and he died with this incredible love even for those that are killing him. Paul's not affected by it. And Paul doesn't get saved because of Stephen's death. When Jesus was hanging on the cross, there were 2 men on crosses either side of him. One of them got saved, but not for Stephen. No one got saved. Like, I don't know anyone that has opened up a Bible that's not a Christian and started reading the 60 verses that's recorded of Stephen's preaching. I don't know anyone that's ever read that and became a Christian. But John, he just writes a couple of lines, one verse, John 3:16, and that does it for most people, not for Stephen. And Stephen, he didn't die a hero at the end of the movie and the world gets saved from aliens. No one gets saved. And then it actually even gets a little bit worse, so stay with us. In Acts chapter 8, it begins with this. On that day, a great persecution broke out against the church at Jerusalem, and everyone except the apostles were scattered throughout Samaria and Judea. There are only 2 ways to know God. One is through what he does, and the other is through who he is. And just when you think you've worked out what God will do, he'll do what you're not expecting. In Isaiah 55, God declares this. He says, "My thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts." Bashing Stephen to death with rocks, and with the Roman occupying government not even stepping in to do anything, which it was an illegal killing, but they turned their back, they turned a blind eye to it, they ignored it, and that helped to fuel this persecution that was focused towards all those early Christians, and it scattered them to every other known part of the world. How did they get there? They got there through the latest technology, through Roman roads. I want you to get what I'm about to say. God's ways are so different to our ways. What God allows, we would stop. And in the opening chapter of Acts, Jesus is about to leave planet Earth, and he gives his final instructions. And he says, "I want you to take this good news about the kingdom, about my ways, to Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth." But the early church, it wasn't going anywhere. They were comfortable, just like us. They were happy to stay in their own little world. When Stephen died, his death sparked a persecution that took the good news of the gospel, of God's ways, to every known part of the world. And in God's timing, there was technology already available for that to happen, to take what the persecution did to move the church to where God needed them to go. Throughout the whole Bible, God keeps referring to his ways, his way. And even starting in Genesis chapter 3, when Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden, they are banned from the tree of life. But they're not just banned. God actually sets angels, that it says, to guard the way to the tree of life. Jesus says he's the way, the truth, and the life. And because Israel, they never got to know God's ways, they never got to enter his rest. But Moses did. And when Jesus says to me, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest," how does he do that? He does it by us taking his yoke upon us, what he would give us to carry, what fits us. And he says, "And learn from me." What do we learn? We learn God's ways. That's what we learn. And then Jesus says, "And you'll find rest for your souls." 10 days ago, I did a Google search on trying to find on YouTube sermons on knowing God's ways. And then I counted them up. And do you know how many I found? One. That was it. On all that never country out there, in space, wherever it all is, one. And then I changed it one word, and I changed it to knowing God's will. There's a zillion, billion sermons, messages, talks on knowing God's will. Over the years, I've had people come to me regularly and ask me to pray with them that they could know God's will. I've never, ever had someone come to me and ask me to pray for them that they could know God's ways. And in Psalm 101, which we read out earlier, where David writes, this is the NIV, it says, "He made known his ways to Moses, his deeds to the people of Israel." The New Living Translation puts it this way: "He revealed his character to Moses." Most of the translations say he made his ways known to Moses. And then they say his deeds, his acts, his doings, his works to the children of Israel. But some translations say this: He made known his ways to Moses, his will to the children of Israel. Don't miss this. You can know God's will, you can do God's will, and never enter his rest because you don't know his ways. I want to get really practical just as we finish up. I want to get really practical and give you how this works in real life. As a Christian, you may believe that it's God's will that you tithe 10% of your income to a local church. So is that based on your net or your gross income? Does that apply to if you've had a boat for a long time and then you sell it? What about the car you traded in or the car you sold or the house you sold? Now, you might be basing that on Malachi chapter 3, and I'm going to read it to you. And it's God talking. He says, "Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty. See if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that you will not have enough room for it." And then God goes on to even promise protection against natural disasters if we don't rob him of the tithes and offerings. Now, I'm not trying to do a discussion on the benefits or the pros and cons of tithing. I just want to show you how it's possible to be doing exactly what you believe and what you feel is God's will and miss and not know his ways. I have a friend, and he heard sort of teaching on tithing before he became a Christian. He heard things like, you can't outgive God, that the more you give God, the more he'll give it back to you. And he believed that. So he came to the church that we're part of, and he came and gave a tithe 10% on his whole income for 12 months. Now, to begin with, he didn't really want to know anything about God. He was simply just doing this as a financial investment. But he did come to know God, and he became a Christian. And at the time, he was self-employed, and in the next 12 months, his income in his business grew by 40%. Over the years, like Israel, he could tell you stories of God's provision financially for him, of things that God had done for him in his life. But over the time of God doing things for him, I don't believe he actually ever got to know God's ways. He certainly never entered God's rest. And very sadly today, he's very far from God. Those verses in Malachi, they were written to Israel. They came under a covenant of blessings and curses. And they are written to one nation, Israel, not to Australia, not to America, but Israel. And it's a covenant of law. And 2,000 years ago, Jesus superseded this with a covenant of grace. And you can't mix the two. Because if you try to mix the two, you're going back to law. And people who say things like, well, America or Australia is under a curse from God. God never made a covenant with Australia or America or any other nation based on blessings and curses. That was just with Israel. You can't say that. It's not true. Under grace, a rich young influencer comes to Jesus and he asks Jesus this question: how can he really know God? It's fascinating how Jesus responds. Watch what he does. He says, well, you do know God, but you only know God through doing his will. And Jesus actually even lists things that are God's will. And this young bloke says, yeah, I've done all those. I've kept all those. Like, I've done all that since I was young. And that included tithing on his income. But Jesus says to him, there's one thing you lack. You don't yet know my ways. See, under law, God's will is to give 10% of your income. But under grace, God's ways are over the top, extravagance. It's like we just have what we have on loan. It's not ours. It's a bit like if I borrow something from someone, I appreciate using it. But if they need it back, I can give it back to them and I can do it freely because I just had it on loan. It was never really mine. And Jesus says to this young influencer, he says, I know that you have a lot of money, a lot of possessions. In fact, your identity is tied up in them. In fact, they have you. And I want you to step into this new way, out of law and under grace. I want you to understand God's ways. And God's way for you is to sell everything you have and give to the poor. And then you'll be free. And you'll be free to follow me. But he didn't do that. See, God's way is a way of grace. Under law, God's okay with giving to get. But under grace, Jesus says it's better to give than receive. Under law, God is restricted to blessings and curses to one nation. But under grace, God's new covenant was with individuals. It's with you. It's with me and every nation on this earth. God's ways are to bless, even if you don't give. In Matthew chapter 6, Jesus puts it this way. Seek first his ways, his kingdom, relationship with him, and all your physical, your financial needs will all be met. It's a promise. And there's no fine print with it. There's no fine print saying God will only do that if you give 10% of your income. It's just not there. Now, don't misunderstand me. The principle, the law of sowing and reaping will last to the end of this earth. It's here now. Sowing and reaping works, and it's a principle that God's woven in. It's his ways. And so for Cora and I, we choose to tithe as a starting point. It's a way of disciplining our giving. It's like you can want to live generously, but just not do it. And so we've found that as a way that helps us. Now, knowing God's ways takes time. It comes from being in his presence, of being relationally connected to him. And a few weeks ago, an individual came to our team down on the river. He claimed to be a Christian, and he started yelling abuse at our live streaming team because of what they'd done with the vaccinations. And prior to that, this individual had told me that he's a Christian, that he reads the Bible every day, he studies the Bible every day, and that he would like an hour of my time to teach me about vaccinations and what's behind them. He was convinced that he had knowledge that others didn't have, but he had no clue of God's ways. See, God's ways are not to divide, but to unite. God's wild card is love, and it trumps every other card in the pack, including self-opinionated knowledge. In fact, the only measuring stick that God uses for Christian maturity is love. God's ways involve his love being completed, made perfect in us. And you can see that in how well that you love others in practical ways. And when that's happening in your life, you'll have no fear. Because to be able to do that, to love well, Jesus has to be this benevolent boss of your life, the Lord of your life. And when that's taking place, you'll be known as a person of hope in a culture of fear. And you'll know his rest because you know his ways. I'm going to pray. Lord, I thank you that you want us to know your ways above everything else. Who you are, why, how you think, why you do what you do. It's all available for us to know your ways. And it brings rest. We don't have to struggle. We don't have to live confused in what you're doing or not doing. And I thank you for the capacity for a human being to know the ways of the God that made this universe, that put everything together in its place. I thank you that you invite us into that space, that you would actually allow us to know your ways. And so over the next couple of weeks, I want us to dig deeper into this. There is so much to this. I want it to be really practical. I want it to be really helpful. And I'm believing that's actually going to set some of you free and change the way you do life. So until next week, we'll see you later. Thank you.